At 04:37 a.m. on August 15, 1944, near Aveluy Wood, France, Lieutenant Robert Williams crouched in mud beside his canvas tank. The low hum of diesel generators vibrated through pre-dawn fog. Visibility, less than 50 meters. A German reconnaissance transmission crackled through intercepted frequencies, position reports, movement orders. Williams gripped the cold steel frame hidden beneath painted fabric. His last radio contact from forward observers still echoed. Movement confirmed. Armored column. Estimated strength 24 vehicles. The sound of treads carried across flat terrain, heavy and methodical. A Panzer division probing Allied positions. The tank Williams commanded was plywood, canvas and welded pipe, constructed in 72 hours by Royal Engineers using requisitioned materials. It wasn't armoured, it didn't need to be real, it only needed to look convincing from 300 metres, in fog, against fatigued reconnaissance crews. That was enough. The operation depended on it. August 12, 1944. Williams stood in a requisitioned barn converted to workshop, clipboard pressed against his chest. Behind him, Royal Engineers welded frames and stretched canvas across skeletal structures. These men had spent the previous month building Bailey bridges and clearing minefields. Now they constructed deception. Williams examined the nearest mock tank, a wooden framework draped in treated canvas, fitted with a false gun barrel fashioned from drainage pipe. The turret, fabricated from scrap metal and chicken wire, barely cleared 2 meters. Camouflage netting concealed the seams. The entire assembly weighed less than 400 kilograms. A radio operator approached. "Lieutenant, Division Command wants confirmation. Will these hold up under observation?" Williams turned, doubt flickering across his face before discipline reasserted itself. "They'll hold long enough." Hammering and acetylene torches continued their rhythm. The Royal Engineers had always adapted to battlefield requirements, bridging rivers under fire, demolishing obstacles, fortifying positions. But this assignment was different. If the deception failed, forward units would face German armour without warning. Yet given German numerical superiority in this sector, illusion was the only tactical option available. Williams checked his watch. 36 hours until deployment. The night before the mission, Williams sat against the canvas side of a mock tank. Grease and scorched metal hung in the air. His men worked in silence, exhaustion visible in their movements, but each understood his assignment. They would operate a deception against an experienced enemy. Williams closed his eyes, rehearsing the plan mentally. The terrain favoured the operation. Open fields with minimal cover, forcing advancing armour into predictable approach routes. Intelligence reports indicated German reconnaissance patterns. Visual confirmation before commitment of main forces. There was no actual armour here, no firepower, only the suggestion of defensive strength. Williams felt his men's tension. Their unspoken questions mirrored his own doubts. The Panzer crews they faced had survived campaigns across North Africa and Eastern Europe. How would veteran tankers react to hastily constructed decoys? What if morning light exposed the deception too early? Williams opened his eyes and studied the mock tank beside him. The canvas skin moved slightly in the breeze. Everything depended on fog, distance, and German caution. He stood and walked the perimeter, checking each position. At 02 he ordered his men to rest. 4 hours remained. At 04 a.m., fog reduced visibility to approximately 80 meters. The canvas tanks stood in predetermined positions across the field, spaced to suggest a defensive line. Williams climbed into the cramped turret compartment of his assigned decoy, checking the mock gun barrel one final time. The structure wasn't designed for prolonged occupation, just long enough to maintain the illusion. Through binoculars, he observed the first indicators of German movement. Reconnaissance vehicles, likely SDKFZ 232 armoured cars, advancing ahead of the main column, their engines carried clearly through still air. The vehicles paused at intervals, crews assessing terrain. Williams keyed his radio, voice measured despite underlying tension. All positions hold, no movement, regardless of proximity. The hours before dawn passed slowly. Each minute brought German forces closer to the decision point. Williams adjusted his position, feeling the wooden frame creak beneath him. If reconnaissance crews closed within 100 meters, the deception would collapse. The operation required German caution, a willingness to halt and assess, rather than advance aggressively. Everything depended on their doctrine, their fatigue, their respect for Allied defensive capabilities. Williams checked his watch again. 30 minutes to first light. At 05:30 a.m., the sound of German armour became unmistakable. Williams counted engine signatures, at least 20 vehicles, possibly more obscured by terrain. The vibration travelled through earth into the wooden frame beneath him. The plan was precise: create sufficient doubt to slow the German advance, allowing actual Allied armour to manoeuvre into flanking positions. Williams checked his watch, then his radio. Forward observers confirmed Allied tanks moving into position 3 kilometers west. He waited for the signal. Machine gun fire erupted somewhere to the north, a probe or contact with actual Allied positions. There was no retreat available now. Williams raised his flare pistol and fired. The red star arced into grey sky. The operation was committed. The first German tank emerged through dissipating fog, a Panzer IV, turret traversing methodically, engine note deep and powerful. Williams forced himself to breathe steadily. The tank commander would be scanning through optics, assessing targets, estimating range and threat. The mock tanks stood motionless, their profiles designed to suggest hull-down defensive positions. Williams's hand tightened on the radio handset. Every second the Germans delayed was another second for Allied forces to maneuver. The Panzer IV's turret stopped, oriented directly toward Williams's position. As the first wave of German armour advanced, Williams observed through binoculars, heart rate elevated but hands steady. He watched German tank commanders exchange hand signals. Their forward momentum slowed perceptibly. Engine sounds shifted from advance to idle. The mock tanks remained stationary, their painted canvas sides presenting the silhouette of armoured threat. A voice crackled through Williams's radio. "Are they buying it?" Williams exhaled slowly. "Affirmative, they've reduced speed." Through his optics he saw German infantry dismount from half-tracks, moving cautiously forward. Standard doctrine when facing possible anti-tank positions. The deception was holding, but Williams knew the margin was razor thin. Any German crew closing to within 200 meters would identify the deception. Morning light continued strengthening, burning off fog that had provided crucial concealment. Williams scanned the German line. Approximately 15 vehicles visible now, with more likely in reserve. Their formation suggested caution rather than aggressive assault. They had seen what appeared to be defensive armour and responded doctrinally: halt, assess, coordinate. Each minute of German hesitation provided Allied forces additional time to complete their manoeuvre. Williams glanced at his watch. The flanking force should be in position within 10 minutes. He keyed his radio. "All stations maintain positions. Do not break cover under any circumstances." In the tense silence, Williams watched through binoculars as the lead German tanks halted at the field's edge. The canvas decoys stood like sleeping predators, their false gun barrels oriented toward the enemy line. Tension compressed the air. This was the critical moment when the operation would validate or collapse. A single probing shot would reveal the deception instantly. Canvas and wood would not deflect even small arms fire, but the operation no longer depended solely on illusion. It was about buying time, creating uncertainty, forcing German commanders to pause and coordinate rather than exploit what they perceived as a gap in Allied defences. Williams's breath came faster despite his efforts at control. He whispered into his radio handset, "Hold positions, just hold." A German tank commander stood visible in his cupola, scanning the Allied line through binoculars. Williams could see the man's face at this distance, studying, calculating, suspicious. The German officer lowered his binoculars and ducked into his turret. Williams tensed. If the Germans decided to fire a ranging shot, the deception ended immediately. Seconds stretched. The German tank remained stationary. Williams allowed himself the smallest measure of relief. They were still uncertain, still cautious, still waiting for additional reconnaissance before committing their force. The illusion held. By 06 a.m., German forces began advancing again, but with increased caution. Tanks moved in short bounds, infantry spread in skirmish lines, weapons trained forward. The stage was set. The first Allied tank round arrived without warning, a high explosive shell impacting 30 meters beyond the German lead vehicle. The explosion threw dirt and smoke skyward, creating immediate chaos. The sound reached Williams a fraction of a second after the visual flash, the pressure wave making the canvas structure shudder. But it was only the opening. Real Allied armour, now in flanking positions, opened coordinated fire. The roar was immense, multiple guns firing in sequence, shells screaming overhead, impacts erupting across the German formation. The canvas decoys remained motionless, still perfectly positioned as they had been designed. Williams gripped the wooden frame, eyes fixed on the battlefield as explosions created curtains of smoke and debris. German tanks began returning fire, but their targets were the flanking Allied positions, not the decoys. The deception had succeeded in its primary mission, fixing German attention forward while Allied armour struck from the flank. Williams counted at least 4 German tanks burning within the first 90 seconds. His hands trembled, but he maintained position, watching the operation unfold exactly as planned. As the engagement intensified, a German shell exploded approximately 20 meters from Williams's position. The blast wave struck the canvas tank, and the entire structure collapsed inward. Williams was thrown against the wooden framework, ears ringing, vision blurred by dust and smoke. He tasted blood and dirt. When his hearing partially returned, he heard screaming. One of his men in a nearby decoy had been wounded by shrapnel. More shells impacted across the field as German gunners, now aware of the deception, directed fire at anything resembling a target. The roar of explosions merged into continuous thunder. Williams keyed his radio, but received only static. He crawled from the collapsed framework, keeping low. Across the field, 3 other canvas tanks had been destroyed or damaged. He saw 2 Royal Engineers running toward cover, one limping badly. The cost of the deception was being paid in real casualties. The soldiers' position to maintain the illusion had become targets themselves once the German crews understood they'd been deceived. Williams spotted a crater and rolled into it, pressing against cold earth as shells continued impacting. The radio in his hand finally crackled with a transmission. Fragmented, barely audible. Multiple casualties. Need medic. The mock tanks had fulfilled their tactical purpose, but that success was measured in broken bodies and destroyed equipment. By 06:30 a.m., the battle had evolved into close-range chaos. The Germans, now fully aware of the deception, directed fire toward any movement near the destroyed canvas structures, but their tactical situation had deteriorated critically. What they had initially perceived as a prepared defensive line had been revealed as deception, but by then, Allied armour had established killing positions on their flank. Williams observed from his crater as German tanks attempted to reorient, presenting their vulnerable side armour to Allied gunners. The exchange was brutally uneven. 3 more German tanks erupted in flames within 2 minutes. Black smoke rose in thick columns. The roar of gunfire was constant. Cannon reports, machine guns, the crack of high-explosive shells detonating. Williams watched a Panzer IV take a direct hit to its turret, the explosion blowing the hatch open and sending debris skyward. The German formation began disintegrating. Some tanks reversed rapidly, seeking any available cover. Others continued fighting, trading rounds with Allied armour in a desperate attempt to create space for withdrawal. The mock tanks, though damaged and exposed as fakes, had accomplished their mission. The German Panzer division had been caught between deception forward and real armour on their flank, exactly the tactical dilemma the operation was designed to create. Williams pressed against the crater wall as another shell screamed overhead. At 07 a.m., fog had completely lifted, revealing the full scope of the engagement. Williams raised his head cautiously and assessed the battlefield. The German line was in retreat. At least 9 tanks were burning or abandoned, their crews either dead or withdrawing on foot. The remaining German armour pulled back in fighting withdrawal, laying smoke and maintaining suppressive fire. Allied tanks pursued carefully, maintaining formation discipline. Williams climbed from the crater and surveyed the wreckage of the canvas deception. Of the 12 mock tanks his engineers had constructed, 7 were completely destroyed, 3 badly damaged, 2 relatively intact. The structures that had seemed so convincing in pre-dawn darkness now looked absurdly flimsy in full daylight. Collapsed frameworks, torn canvas, exposed wooden supports. Yet they had worked. Against veteran panzer crews, against experienced reconnaissance, the deception had created sufficient uncertainty to delay German advance for the crucial minutes needed. Williams walked slowly across the field, counting casualties. 3 Royal Engineers dead, 5 wounded seriously enough to require immediate evacuation, the price of illusion. He found the radio operator who had questioned him 3 days earlier, sitting against a destroyed decoy, bandaging his own leg. The man looked up at Williams and nodded once. No words were necessary. They had survived. The operation had succeeded. The impossible deception had held. By 08:02 a.m., the battlefield had fallen quiet except for the crackling of burning vehicles and occasional small arms fire in the distance. Williams stood among the wreckage of the canvas tanks, exhaustion replacing adrenaline. The fog had cleared completely, revealing terrain littered with destroyed equipment. German and Allied both, though the ratio heavily favoured Allied success. He counted the cost visually: burnt-out German armour, abandoned positions, the shattered remains of the deception operation. Medics worked among the wounded Royal Engineers, applying field dressings and preparing casualties for evacuation. Williams approached each wounded man, speaking briefly, offering what reassurance he could. One engineer, his arm splintered, managed a weak smile. "Did it work, sir?" Williams nodded. It worked. He turned away, looking across the field at the 2 surviving intact canvas tanks. From 200 meters, even in daylight, they maintained a passing resemblance to actual armor. Close inspection revealed the truth: wood, canvas, paint, and desperation. But the Germans hadn't been granted close inspection. They had approached cautiously, been fixed in place by the illusion, and suffered catastrophic flanking fire as a result. Williams checked his watch and keyed his radio. "Command, this is Williams. Objective secured, requesting casualty evacuation and engineer recovery." The response was immediate. "Acknowledged. Well done." Williams lowered the radio. The canvas tanks had fulfilled their purpose. 3 days later, Williams returned to the field where the mock tanks had stood. The site had been cleared of German wreckage, but the destroyed canvas structures remained, testament to the operation's cost. Some of his men were gone permanently. Private Morrison, who had welded the first gun barrel; Corporal Hughes, who had insisted the camouflage netting be precisely positioned; Sergeant Davis, who had questioned whether canvas could deceive veteran tank crews. All three had died maintaining the illusion, remaining in position as shells impacted around them. Williams stood at the crater where Morrison's position had been. The young engineer had stayed in his decoy tank until a direct hit killed him instantly. His dedication to the deception had bought seconds that contributed to the operation's success. Williams thought about the mathematics of warfare. 3 lives traded for German tanks destroyed, for Allied advance enabled, for strategic advantage gained. The equation was brutal and impersonal. Yet each man in that equation had a name, a history, a family waiting for notification. Williams removed his helmet and stood in silence. The canvas tanks had saved lives by creating tactical advantage, but they hadn't come without cost. The deception's success was measured in both German losses and Allied casualties. Morrison, Hughes, and Davis had understood the risk. They had believed in the plan. They had executed it perfectly. The war continued through autumn and into 1945, but the canvas tank operation became a documented example of battlefield deception. Williams received no medal, no public recognition. The operation remained classified for tactical reasons, but within engineering and intelligence circles, the Aveluy Wood deception was studied as a case study in asymmetric warfare. How 12 hastily constructed mock tanks had fixed a German Panzer division in place, long enough for Allied armour to achieve devastating tactical advantage. The after-action report filed on August 18, 1944, noted, "Enemy forces delayed approximately 45 minutes by deception operation. Resulting flanking manoeuvre achieved 3.1 kill ratio with minimal Allied losses." The numbers were clinical, stripped of human context. They didn't mention Morrison welding by lamplight, or Hughes adjusting camouflage netting with obsessive precision, or Davis questioning whether the plan would work. Williams returned to his unit as new operations demanded attention, but the memory of the mock tanks never faded. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he thought about what the operation proved. That ingenuity could multiply force, that deception could shift tactical balance, that sometimes the greatest weapon wasn't armor or firepower, it was the enemy's uncertainty. The canvas tanks existed now only in classified files and fading photographs, but their legacy endured in the principle they demonstrated. Warfare wasn't always about superior equipment. Sometimes it was about superior thinking. The file on the Aveluy Wood deception closed without ceremony. The numbers had already rewritten tactical doctrine,